Welcome to our annual ESOP Podcast Summer School Series. We selected some of our favorite episodes over the past year to bring you for your enjoyment while we spend the rest of our summer catching our breath and working on launching our exciting Season 7 beginning in September 2023. Enjoy!
Welcome to the ESOP Podcast with Bret Keisling, part of the ESOP Podcast Network.
Hello, my friends. Thank you for listening. My name is Bret Keisling, and as it says on my business cards, I'm a passionate advocate for employee ownership. I am really hesitant to call myself, even though it's true, it's on my business cards, a passionate advocate for employee ownership when I am talking to the passionate advocate for employee ownership for decades now. It is my great pleasure to be joined by Corey Rosen, founder of the NCEO and co-author with John Case of Ownership, Reinventing Companies, Capitalism, and Who Owns What. Corey, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Bret. I really appreciate it.
Corey, let me just share a little bit from your bio for the NCEO, and so that the audience, if they're not familiar, you are the founder of the NCEO. You've authored a number of books and materials in addition to the one I just mentioned. Over the years, you've written, edited, or contributed to dozens of books, articles, and research papers on employee ownership. You've been called the leading expert on employee ownership in the world, and I certainly believe that. You've been interviewed widely by major media, and you've spoken all over the world, and I'm just so grateful that you're here today.
Well, I am too. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Corey, we're going to talk about your book, and that is being released September 13th. There's a launch party September 20th. You can find information on the event page at nceo.org. And we're going to talk about all of that. But Corey, I mentioned your name comes up a lot on the podcast, and your official biography doesn't really do justice. And one of the reasons why I can't overstate the value and the role you've played in employee ownership, besides being the founder of the NCEO, your name came up. You were with a group of originators of lots of different organizations. EOX, I believe you had a hand in helping to start that. Ownership America. Your name has come up even in England. Graham Nuttall, OBE, who's the leading employee ownership expert in England. And there are probably many other organizations. You are not just the leading voice of employee ownership, but the leader in collaboration in employee ownership. And I just want to thank you for it. It's very impressive, everything that you have helped create.
Well, thank you. And my thanks really goes to the employee ownership community because it's given me a wonderful, satisfying life.
I love that. So, Corey, we are going to talk about your book and some other things, but as you know, we like to start our podcast with what we call the EO aha moment. And normally we ask the guests to share the very first time they heard about employee ownership, where it resonated with them, where they thought it could be transformative. And in your case, you've probably had numerous aha moments through your career. So I was wondering, is there one or two that stand out that you'd like to share that have just been EO aha moments for you?
Really, the moment when I first found out about it still does stand out as the one. That was back in 1978, and I was a 28-year-old Senate staff person. And one day I didn't have a whole lot to do that day. So I was reading the congressional record, which is something you would be doing only if you were extraordinarily bored that day and wanted to look busy. And there was this article, actually it was some testimony by a professor named William White. Now I knew who William White was. People of my generation probably know who he was. If you took a sociology course, then you read his book about street corner society. And he had been at Cornell when I was at Cornell as a graduate student, although I never took any of his classes. And this testimony that he gave was about this idea, employee ownership. And then what's that? How does that work? And so I read that and I thought, this is really interesting because I really always wanted just to have a cause to fight. That was all that interested me in a career. And what I'd learned on Capitol Hill in a relatively short time, and I'd been a political scientist studying Congress prior to that, which is how I got to Capitol Hill, was that if you wanted to create things that helped people manage their lives better, Social Security, Medicare, things like that, the only practical way to do it was to make these benefits broadly available to everyone. That's the only way you could get political support for them. And so those of us who wanted to create further change to make people's lives more economically secure faced a real problem, because in order to do that, you had to create programs that, because they were so broad-based, were so expensive that they really weren't able to get the political support they needed. And in fact, maybe they did in fact cost too much money. Maybe the opponents had a point that this was not good for the economy. So there was this inevitable trade-off, it seemed, between economic efficiency and economic fairness. Employee ownership seemed like a different model, because it said, wait a minute, if you divide up ownership between more people, that it won't be just dividing up the existing pie, it will create a bigger pie, because companies will perform better and people will have money to reinvest in their communities and their children and their futures. And this could be a good thing for everybody. And as I learned more about this, I learned about this idea of ESOPs. And the core concept behind ESOPs, of course, was that you provide tax incentives for business owners to share ownership with employees. And so I thought, this is perfect. This is a way to use the free enterprise system to create economic fairness and economic dignity for people in a way that Republicans liked and Democrats liked. So this was not one of those ideas that in order to work either had to be so expensive or so politically impractical that it was just a pipe dream. This was something that was politically feasible and that it appeared, at least early on, might work economically. So I thought, I'm going to get involved in that. I'm going to do something to try to help make this idea happen. And so I got involved in some of the legislation. Most notably, I drafted what became Section 1042, the section of the tax code that allows owners to defer tax on the gain from the sale of their company, drafted the ESOP provision of the Chrysler Loan Guarantee Act and the Small Business Employee Ownership Act. And all these things passed with that same coalition of Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals. And I thought, once I get out and form this organization, lots of people are going to do this because it's such a good idea. Of course, it turned out to be a tougher climb than that, but that was really my moment.
Corey, I love that for lots of different reasons. You're sitting on Capitol Hill and, just the genesis of, had it been a more exciting day, who knows, although presumably you would have found it on another day. But it also strikes in contrast, and we've been collecting the aha moments for a couple of years now, and there are those of us like me, candidly, that did really well as an ESOP trustee for a good part of my career and loved it as a business model and as a transaction and loved that, generate the leads and do the deals and loved it. But I came to realize that employee ownership was also addressing a lot of the social issues that are of concern to me. The wealth inequality, the wage inequality, the instability, the communities and stuff that we'll talk about more. And so it was, I drank the Kool-Aid in a, kind of an unfortunate phrase, and that's where I'm at now. But there are many folks like you that I just love and appreciate that you were looking for a cause, as you said it, and you were looking for a way to do good. And so you came from, the mirror image of the way a number of us came, but that's just really cool. And certainly so much has sprung from that. You mentioned growing the pie, and it reminded me of something that I was going to say in the intro and it slipped my mind. One of my favorite anecdotes that we've had on the podcast, and also because of where it came from, but Michael Keeling was on 2 or 3 years ago. And it was coming up at Employee Ownership Month. And I said, hey, Michael, can you tell us how employee ownership came about? And Michael was like, it was Corey Rosen. As a matter of fact, Corey came to the ESOP Association and the board chose not to participate for a couple of years, but gave you the credit for making it happen. And the grow the pie, and share the pie is now the mantra for everybody. And I just wanted to mention that contribution that you've made to employee ownership.
Well, when we first thought of employee ownership, then we had a staff person who later became the research director for the steelworkers. His name was Mike Yaffe. We were a little tiny struggling organization. I didn't get paid for the first 3 years, in fact. And Mike was an intern, very bright guy. And he had this terrific idea. that he would send out these invitations by mail to a whole bunch of companies to have employee ownership week. And he put little pieces of paper in them, shredded up, so that when they opened up the card, there would be all these kind of celebratory glitter stuff. What happened is they opened the card and it all fell on the floor and they had to clean it up. They weren't very happy about that, but I guess it did get people's attention.
Well,
The ESOP Association at the time didn't like the idea of Employee Ownership Month for peculiar reasons, but after a couple of years, they decided they did. And so now it's become an institution that I think is quite useful.
And it's very useful. And there is that practical side to it. But it's so wonderful to see what the companies do and how they put into employee ownership. And again, just going back to Michael for one final time, Michael makes clear ESOP Association started doing it because they had to, because everybody was doing it. Michael very much acknowledged that you got it off and running. And at a certain point, for the same reason I celebrated, I didn't realize the genesis of it at all, but it's a cool thing and great opportunity for the companies to celebrate themselves. And for those of us who are, supporting employee ownership in our different ways to help get in on the fun and celebration. So just kudos on that idea. So Corey, let's talk about the book and, the themes. Some of them you have referenced in your aha moment, of looking to make the difference in the cause. And certainly reinventing capitalism, is an important subject that people are looking at how to make our system more fair. So tell us about the book and tell us the themes you'd like to from the book.
So the basic concept of the book is that capitalism's broken, and it's broken because ownership is broken. When people talk about ways to fix capitalism, some people say, well, we need fewer regulations, or we need lower taxes, or we need more redistribution, or we need minimum wages. None of those fixes, whether they're from the right or from the left, none of those fixes deal with the core problem of who owns all this capital. Louis Kelso, who created the ESOPs back in the 1950s, his core idea was that as we move through the coming generations, that returns to capital would soar and returns to wages would stagnate. Now we might look at that and say, that's obvious. But back then, I remember I was a young faculty member at a small college in Wisconsin in 1973 or 4. And 60 Minutes had a segment on ESOPs with Louis Kelso and the world famous economist Paul Samuelson. And Samuelson basically said that Kelso was out of his mind. He was not an economist, didn't know what he was talking about, that this notion that when there's more money invested in capital, that wages will somehow suffer was totally screwy. That in fact, throughout all of economic history, when labor productivity went up because of investments in capital and in machinery and technology, the wages went up. But Kelso's argument was there are going to be a lot of forces pushing it down, that so much is going to be invested in capital that the pace of capital change would grow much faster than ever before and faster than wages could keep up. And people were going to move out of jobs that were skilled jobs in manufacturing that will be replaced by technology and capital into much lower paid jobs in the service sector. Of course, that's exactly what happened. Kelso couldn't have foreseen back then that you'd have the technology revolution we have, nor could he really have foreseen the way globalization has pushed down wages. But those things have happened. And so since the 1970s, when that 60 Minutes program was on, real wages adjusted for inflation are slightly lower than they were when Paul Samuelson said that Louis Kelso was a kook. But the real return on capital investment, owning stocks and companies, has grown at over 8% per year. That's meant, obviously, if you own stuff, you've gotten richer and richer. And if you don't, it's gotten harder and harder. Not only are your wages stagnant, but costs for things like healthcare, education have gone up tremendously relative to what they were in those days, even adjusted for inflation. So these have become a bigger burden on people's budget, such that depending on the survey you use, About half the population can't come up with $1,000 or $400 in an emergency. 50% of the workforce in the private sector is in no retirement plan at all. The median account balance in a retirement plan in a private company is therefore zero. So we're looking at people having, and I think people often talk about the issue of wealth inequality. We focus more on the issue of wealth insecurity, the inability of people to accumulate enough wealth to feel secure about their retirement, to feel secure about their ability to get a mortgage, to send their kids to college, to survive the next crisis. And that wealth insecurity has only gotten worse, and there's no reason to think it's going to get better on its own. So we're not going to solve this problem with the ideas that have been generated so far. But ownership is a way to do it. Kelso was right. If more people could be owners of productive capital, then more people could participate in this bonanza that's happened. So that's why we thought it's so critical to make this change. And we talk about the alternative systems of ownership in the US right now, public company, quote unquote, ownership. And the reason I say that is there is no real ownership in public companies in any traditional sense. Most people own stock in companies in the same way that they own the horse that they're betting on at the racetrack. They're simply making a bet on the company's performance. They are not investors in any meaningful sense. And the big institutional owners of these companies, most of their trades are done by algorithm where the ownership, quote unquote, is literally held for fractions of a second. So if I'm the CEO of a public company and my average tenure is 5 years, which it is, and I'm thinking about, I want to create a company for the sustainable future in terms of the way I treat people, in terms of my investments in environmental sustainability or whatever. Those are all costly things that may pay off in the future. I don't have future past, several years here probably. And I for sure don't have a future if our earnings aren't looking good the next quarter. So that system of ownership has become totally disengaged from any meaningful concept of ownership. It's great we have public markets. They serve a lot of functions, but they don't serve that one.
Corey, let me just, if I can, interject quickly. Two things that resonated. First of all, with the CEO who's going to be there 5 years, the contracts often have incentives, financial incentives to the CEO to buff up, profit and earnings as much as possible. And the other thing, and I get really frustrated because I'm in the employee ownership space, inflation is a real problem and public companies are announcing record profits. And it's like, we have to raise our prices to, meet inflation. And that's part of the soullessness of the public corporations or the lack of a rudder.
Put it. Yeah. Right. You get punished for that. So you may want to do it, but it's pretty tricky to do it. So then we've got private equity. Private equity is a longer time frame, 3 to 7 years. Not exactly long, but longer. And their goal, of course, is to turn these companies around quickly by cutting costs. That's the easiest way to make them more profitable, to sell these days most likely to another private equity company. Now, there are private equity companies that do really good things that really make the companies that they purchase better. But overall, the data show that employment at companies purchased by private equity firms drops and benefits drop as well. And if you particularly look at areas like the healthcare sector or the veterinarian sector, where there's an interesting effort right now to introduce employee ownership as a model there, they're finding that the demand for profitability is now replacing the demand for care. And if you look, for instance, at the veterinarian sector, they have a suicide rate of vets is 3.5 times that of the general population. And there's a tremendous departure from veterinarians from the business because of these increasing pressures to make more and more money. I mean, it's not all of it is private equity, but it's certainly a contributor. So that model's not that great for people either. And of course, it concentrates wealth in the hands of a very small number of people. And then there's traditional kinds of family ownership, individual ownership of private companies. And that can be great. There can be all sorts of wonderful things associated with that. But every one of those businesses is going to face a transition crisis at some point. And are they going to sell to private equity? Are they going to sell to some big company that isn't particularly invested in the community? So all three of these models have their problems. So why aren't we thinking about creating a new one? And that's the argument of the book, is there is a new one. And there are other new ones too that we talk about in the book. But employee ownership is, I love this term, the adjacent possible. It comes from Stephen Johnson's wonderful book, Where Good Ideas Come From. Everybody should read that. The adjacent possible comes from chemistry. And basically it says, if you're a carbon molecule looking to get it on with another carbon molecule, and that other carbon molecule is just like you produce little carbon molecule babies just like you. But if you find a carbon molecule that's really different from you and you try to get together, that just doesn't work. But if you find the adjacent possible carbon molecule just enough different that what you produce, you start to get some new carbon molecule. And that's how evolution and change occurs. That same concept applies to strategic change, whether it's within your company for a new product or service, or it's a social innovation. And employee ownership's the adjacent possible here. It's not so far away from our possible series of political events that we simply can't do it. And it's not so similar to what we're already doing that it doesn't represent meaningful change. So let's grab onto this. Let's do more than we've done. And we've done a lot. There's lots of tax benefits for ESOPs. But I think, as everybody listening to this podcast knows, when it comes to the way it's viewed by pundits and politicians, we get a pat on the head and we get a, that's nice. Really, that's an inspiring model. Now let's get on to serious proposals for change.
Corey, one of the challenges, it seems to me, and it's just resonated in Kelso's, I think the 1996 edition of one of his books referenced, and I'm going to mess up the number because I didn't realize we'd go here, but there were like 7,300 ESOPs or employee-owned companies in the United States. And the last numbers I saw, we were maybe at 6,300. And I wonder if you have thoughts, if you get people to focus on it, this really is a wonderful model. And in some respects, we've backslid. Do you have any sense, and you referenced in your aha moment, it hasn't played out like we think. What can we do differently?
Well, there's a few reasons for that. One, some of that is artificial. So it was the way that ESOPs were counted. And we really didn't have good numbers from the Department of Labor until several years ago. So the numbers that were being used before, because I was involved in creating them, were educated guesses, but the data were imperfect. You also had a lot of tax credit ESOPs in public companies, which provided a teensy tiny amount of ownership to employees, typically less than 1% of the company, in return for a tax credit. And when you got rid of the tax credit, a lot of those went away. When you created S Corporation ESOPs, there were a couple thousand S Corporation ESOP shell companies that were registered, that got letters of determination, but they never actually did anything, thank God, because they were all scams. So some of that is artificial, but it is fair to say that the number of new ESOPs is pretty much equal to the number of terminated ESOPs, and has been for many years. That it's a little misleading, because while there are about 300 new ESOPs per year, there are probably 400 to 500, maybe more, companies acquired by ESOPs each year. So there's one company in Dallas that's done almost 100 acquisitions in the last 3 years. So a lot of companies are by default becoming ESOPs, but nonetheless, there's not nearly as many new ESOPs as there could be. And that's mostly because people don't even know they can do it, or what they know is wrong, or their advisors have an incentive to get them not to do it. And a lot of advisors do. But there's another problem, which some legislative concepts would address. And that is, if I'm a seller of a closely held company and I want to sell out, we want to become 100% ESOP, I'm going to get a seller note for at least part of that transaction. There's just no other way you can do it. And I may be perfectly happy with that. That may be great. But for many owners of businesses, it's not so great. They want the money up front. They want the certainty and they want the money now. And an ESOP can't accommodate that very easily without getting very expensive secondary debt. So we've been working, of course, with the Ownership America, which has developed a proposal, and a number of us were involved in this, developed a proposal that's called the Employee Equity Loan Act. And hopefully that's going to be introduced this Congress or next. And basically what it does is it takes existing models for loan support through the federal government, particularly a small business investment program, and uses those for ESOPs as well, so that more of that financing can be accomplished up front at reasonable rates of interest. That would be a big deal if that passed. And if the other big deal passes, which would be the Work Act, which is a bill I actually wrote 35 years ago.
Wow,
Kept
that is
nagging
quite a
people
wait
about.
to see some fruition.
Yeah. And the Work Act would create funding for states to set up outreach and education programs for employee ownership. And there is that's now part of retirement reform proposals working their way through Congress. There is a pretty good chance, maybe even a very good chance, that will become law. That would be a big deal.
That would be very incredible. And it seems that there's a good mix of movement on the federal level, and also a number of states are taking steps, a couple of them big steps in the right direction, California, et cetera. And with presumably funding sources comes the education of the professionals, as they're trying to put deals together, they'll master what's available. And that's the other prong of it.
Right. Yeah. We're not going to get over the problem of the business broker who really doesn't want to tell his client to sell to an ESOP, because why should you get 3% of the transaction cost for telling somebody, hey, do you know about an ESOP?
It's a very real problem. And I used to be a lot more hands-on to it, when I was a trustee. But in the last 6 or 8 months, I've had conversations with financial planners, those who have the business owners as their clients. And what I've been saying to them is direct them to an ESOP. You won't get any transaction fees, but they'll have money to invest with you after. So really it's finding the right motivation, and not in a bad way, but finding the incentive, as you say, to get more folks talking about employee ownership.
Yeah, it's going to be a hard battle to win for those kinds of advisors, the brokers, as opposed to financial planners. But also, think about accountants, who may be the first person that a business owner talks to and says, hey, what about employee ownership? Can that work? And let's assume the accountant knows a little bit about this, has heard of it, but really doesn't know a lot about it. That's a safe assumption. There's a natural human tendency. We've all done this. I certainly have done it, is when you don't understand an idea, you tend to think it must be a bad idea and therefore not worth your time to try to figure out how it works. It's a very natural human tendency.
There is that tendency, you're right. I don't know if you're familiar with Darren Gleeman. He was on the podcast a couple of years ago. He does transactions. He does financing, I guess, investment banking, and really loves ESOPs. But what I've taken to call the Gleeman method is he makes it clear how we scare the heck out of everybody. And it's affected me in the last couple of years on the podcast, the way I talk about transactions. I used to, as a trustee, scare the heck out of people. You got to be careful. These are important. There's going to be DOL oversight. There's going to blah, 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 blah. And what Darren did is actually transformed my thinking to, there's complications to them and there's specialization to them, but we've got the experts for them. We've got the experts to handle that. So in the last year or so, when, for example, I'm talking to employee owners, either in the C-suite or rank and file, and they ask what sessions to go to, in the past, I would have said, look at the fiduciary stuff, look at that. And if they want to, that's fine. Now I'm saying, make sure your advisors are going to those sections. As long as the people are trained and we've got the experts, take away a little bit of the fear of the complication. Does that make sense?
It does. And also, it's really important for people to understand. We have an article on this on our website. Are ESOPs really more complicated than selling to some other way? There's this myth that people have in their heads that there's an easy way to sell a business. Somebody just writes you a check and you're done. Well, that doesn't work that way, right? So if you sell to another company, you're still going to need lawyers, and you're going to need evaluation, and you're going to need accountants, and you're going to need financial planning. But if you sell to another company, you're also going to have contingencies in all likelihood. So you sell to an ESOP, probably no contingencies. You sell to some other company, yeah, you probably have contingencies. And it is going to take longer in most cases, and it's going to be more complicated. If any of you have been involved in the sale of an ESOP company, and take out the ESOP piece of it, you know how complicated it is. And that's not even mentioning all the dog and pony shows you need to go through, the due diligence that the buyer is going to want your company to do prior to the transaction. Just take that, for instance. Most buyers are going to want you to do substantial due diligence if you're a company of any size. And that's going to take your team months to go through that. You sell to an ESOP, you know your company, or you need to go through most of that. Some of it, but not most of it.
The other thing that I think a lot of people miss is data that you're certainly well familiar with, and that is only 20% of businesses end up selling. The vast majority of businesses don't end up transitioning, period. And those that sell, I think takes them 4 or 5 cracks at the bat, and that's some of the dog and pony shows. But that's also going pretty far down the transaction, conversation or negotiation when deals fall through. And you put those in. The reality is, if a company, in my experience, if the company is ripe to become an ESOP, and it isn't one size fits all, but it fits a lot of sizes. But if it's on the path to becoming an ESOP, a transaction can be done. You just got to get to the finish line.
Yeah. And it's a lot of work. But again, selling your business is a lot of work, period. Doesn't matter how you sell it. It's a lot of work.
Corey, talk if you can. And when you were speaking about the carbon molecules, it made me think. I've had conversations on the podcast with the organizations that I refer to as being in adjacent spaces. And so, for example, a lot of what we talk about in culture and communication for ESOPs, which is as huge an issue as there is just best practices. And as you referenced with doing the transactions, you take the ESOP out of culture and communication, it's just great practices, to do. Then you have the community organizers. We know that there were 4 times less likely to have layoffs during the pandemic of employee-owned companies, and I think 3 times less likely to have wage reduction compared to non-employee-owned companies during the pandemic. And extrapolating from that, employee owners were less likely to use the food banks or take the advantage of other community safety nets.
Or unemployment insurance.
Unemployment insurance. So how important is it to do a better job of integrating employee ownership with those folks, much like your aha moment? They already have their issues of building community and that sort of thing. Do we have room to make a better presentation of employee ownership to those folks?
We really do. That's an excellent point. I regret a lot of things in the way that certainly what I've done, what we've done, what the whole community has done. I think we've done the best we can, but there's only so many resources that we have to try to get out in front of those sorts of adjacent groups. I don't think the employee ownership community has done nearly as good a job as we might have in getting in front of economic development organizations and community groups, the various business groups who deal with how to manage a company better and so on. It's not for lack of trying, but we haven't found the magic bullets. But I think change is happening. Those of us who have been involved in this field for a long time, there is a really kind of almost universal feeling that this is our moment, that there has never been a time when employee ownership has had as much possibility as it does now. In my state of California, for instance, we are about to pass a law creating a California state employee ownership hub. I assume that the governor will sign it, though we don't know for sure, but it's about to pass the Senate. It's already passed the House and the first vote in the Senate without opposition. Pennsylvania has a good chance of creating an even broader program next year. Tennessee has a good chance of creating a program. There are efforts going on in a number of states. And if any of your listeners are interested in getting an effort going in your state, please do contact me. Because often all it took in California, the origin of this bill was that somebody who knew somebody in the state legislature called and said, "Hey, Josh, what do you think of this idea?" And that's a great idea. Let's run with that. And here we are. So, and the guy, Michael Brownrigg, who did that, that was all he did. And there was a group of us who got involved with their staff on crafting it. We'll help you with that part. Just get us the contacts. Just go contact your state legislature and say, "Hey, Colorado's doing this. Massachusetts has a program. California's about to have a program. Pennsylvania. We should do this too." So that's a big opportunity, is to get these state programs. There's the Work Act in Congress. There's the State Small Business Credit Initiative, provides funding for employee ownership. There's the CHIPS Act, provides outreach funding through manufacturing excellence programs. The idea just seems to be starting to pop up in all sorts of places it never did before. So this is our chance.
Corey, I love that. And I love your invitation to have people reach out to you. And by the way, your contact information, including email and phone number, are on the NCEO website and in the staff directory. And we'll include them in the show notes. Since they're on your website, we'll have a link there as well. But I love that you're suggesting that people reach out to you, because we are seeing a lot of momentum. But it's also the same thing that Steve Storkan has talked about with EOX, where he gets the ambassadors. And if people want to have a state center that don't have a state center, reach out to Steve.
Right.
And we see concrete results. You mentioned Tennessee, and one of the things that I think is really cool, and there are so many different things we can do. And Corey, let me just back up for just a moment, where you said there are different paths you would have taken, things that maybe you wish had played out differently. Where we are at this moment of extremely wonderful opportunity and potential, where everything does seem to be coming together, not the least of which, and we can talk a little bit about, I think there's a reference to the social value of employee ownership that we can talk to for just a moment. But we are at this stage, and I see so many different cool things that could happen. But in Tennessee, Pat Marsh, who was the founder of Big G Express, which is a really well-known employee-owned company, a trucking company, he got elected to State House, and he's the one who sponsored ESOP legislation.
Excellent. Ron Johnson in the Senate, he was the CEO of an ESOP-owned company, and he's a big advocate. He introduced probably the most radical legislation ever to promote employee ownership. In fact, when most of us looked at it, we thought, this is crazy.
Ron Johnson is a good example when we talk about the bipartisan nature of employee ownership. I think it's fair to say that no elected official has done as much for employee ownership as Bernie Sanders has done through the years, and has really done that. And Ron Johnson, who is no Bernie Sanders, is passionate about employee ownership as well. I didn't realize that he had been the CEO of an ESOP.
Yeah, I wondered why he was so passionate about it, and looked at his bio.
I've got to tell you, he did come out with a bill, and I'll just reference this because we have in our minicast archives. And if you'll forgive the shameless plug, people can find our 400 and some episodes at www.esoppodcast.com. But we did a minicast when Senator Johnson introduced his legislation, and it was like, oh, it would do this, it would do that, it would do that. And like 2 weeks later, I had a lawyer and a trustee come on, and we were like, we don't actually quite see how it would work, but we appreciate employee ownership.
Exactly. It was not a practical piece of legislation at all. I had a friend who used to say that employee ownership was the only thing all three Jessies agreed on: Helms, Jackson, and Ventura.
I love that. Well, we see a lot of it today. I've often said, Pat Toomey is the retiring Pennsylvania senator where I'm located, and Ben Cardin in Maryland is, in favor of employee ownership, and Pat Toomey,
a strong advocate.
Pat Toomey is certainly supportive. And I was, one of my pipe dreams or pet dreams would be to have like a town hall in Annapolis with Cardin and Toomey, and only to talk about employee ownership, nothing else. And then have them drive the 2 or 3 hours to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and have a town hall just about employee ownership. And maybe in the 2 or 3 hour car ride, they could find some other stuff to agree on. That would be a good thing. So with all of the political stuff and the bipartisan nature of employee ownership in these very challenging times politically in the world, employee ownership can address social trust. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And if you go to our website, and if you go to esopinfo.org and look for videos under general concepts, scroll down a few and you'll see my talk at the annual conference on this. But what I was talking about, and what I really have come to passionately believe, is we know that social trust is really eroded, and dangerously eroded in this country, where we tend not to trust one another. We tend to think the other person's motives are not good ones. I mean, we're seeing this violently on every side of the political spectrum now. People seeing each other not as people with different interests, but enemies. And you no longer think this is somebody, I might not work with this person today, but I need to try to be cooperative because in the future, I would like that person to work with me. That's what democracy is. That's what it's about. It's that ability to see that there are benefits to both sides to making compromises to work together. Compromise become a dirty word now. Compromise is how democracy works. And there's lots of reasons for the loss of social trust, ranging from the decline of community organizations and activities. People tend to sit home and watch television or watch the internet, the way that the social media has replaced face-to-face interactions. Lots of reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that people no longer think the system is fair. And this is no longer a partisan issue in the sense, at least, that people think the system isn't fair. Why they think it's unfair differs, but pretty much everybody thinks it's unfair. Big business doesn't care about them. Big government doesn't care about them. Everybody's out to screw them, basically. And so you better make sure that you screw them first. This isn't going to end well for us. So what does employee ownership do? Employee ownership, number one, addresses that issue of capitalism not being fair. It makes it more fair. It makes people more economically secure. And when people are insecure, they are much more prone to tyrants. Secondly, whether they're left, right, or whatever, insecurity breeds that kind of find us a leader to lead us out of this mess. The other thing that employee ownership does is most employee ownership companies these days have some kind of high involvement, high trust management system where they're seeking to get people to talk to one another about work, find ways to do things better. It's not an ideological thing, at least for most people. It's a practical thing. There's a book I wrote called Beyond Engagement, How to Make Your Company an Idea Factory. And the first line is it's simple. The best companies are the ones that generate the most ideas from the most people about the most things. And everything else is just commentary on how you get there. So if companies are practicing that and having these conversations, I get used to working with you. I get used to sitting down with somebody who might in some other context be my supervisor or a manager, or somebody who's totally different from me demographically or socially or politically. But we get to know each other and we get to work together. And gee, I can trust you now. It's this model of building out rather than building into consensus. That if you find, and you were just referencing this, Bret, if you find things that you can agree on, start with what you agree on, and then see how you can build out from there. If you start with what you disagree on to try to find the middle ground, chances are it's not going to work. It's going to end angrily. So employee ownership is going to solve all of our problems. But boy, it can be a big step towards doing that. And I honestly, I'm an old guy now, and I think about my kids and my grandkids, and I'm terrified of their future. I think democracy is under serious threat, and we need to do something about it.
And I think it would go a long way. And employee ownership, we see this at, at least the well-run companies where there is a respect for another viewpoint, even if there's not agreement. And there are certainly a number of people in this country that I don't agree with, but I find it valuable to try and figure out where they're coming from.
Yeah, listen to people. Start where they're coming from, not where you're coming from.
Corey, let me ask if I can. What I thought we would do, if you're okay for a few more minutes, is pivot to the community conversation. And it will actually be a little bit of hindsight, but I'd love to talk, we'll tie that into the legislation and the topic that was discussed. But I'd also love to chat a little bit about the collaboration that I think is one of the reasons. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're at this explosive place now with lots of potential, and in the last 2 or 3 years, any number of these organizations have sprung up and are collaborating. So Is it okay if we spend a few minutes on that?
Sure. there's a number of groups now. Some people find this confusing or even think that's terrible, but I think it's a good thing because there are these groups that each have their own particular take on it. And of course, there's the ESOP Association and ESCA, which focus mostly on lobbying efforts, and they've both been around for quite a while. But Ownership America, a new group, Jack Moriarty's, a lot of us involved with Jack see him as a big part of the future of employee ownership, an incredibly dedicated, bright guy with terrific ideas, trying to create more of a grassroots movement around employee ownership, and also to introduce some legislative concepts like the Employee Equity Loan Act that could really help us move forward. I think the two major lobbying groups have understandably spent most of their effort defending what's there rather than expanding it. And Jack is really focused on expanding it. So that's an important effort. Then you've got groups like the various actors in the cooperative worker co-op space, like Project Equity and Democracy at Work, who've been very effective, particularly in getting attention at the local and state levels for finding ways to create programs to support employee ownership, and haven't worked together a lot in the past. We've sort of been friendly to one another, but seen the two things we were doing as very different. That's changed, and we're really working closely together with them on a lot of legislative and local initiatives, and it's been a really good partnership. So, some of these things are happening. And then the Employee Ownership Exchange, whom we've also worked with, creating these state level organizations, all of them right now privately funded, but hopefully some eventually publicly funded, to do more education and outreach at the local level. So that's all really helpful. I think this coalition of efforts is very promising. And the NCEO has done a lot of very collaborative work with ESCA, and really appreciative of their support for the research that we've done. And because of that support, we've done really groundbreaking research. We have 3 full-time researchers on the staff, and Nancy Wiefak, the head of our research group, is considered by just about everybody now the leading researcher in the world on employee ownership amongst academics, not just the employee ownership world. And so we've been able to do some really groundbreaking work thanks to Nancy and Nate and Aaron.
I've met Nancy and Nate at a couple of the conferences or forums, and I actually should get them on future podcast, because one of the things that always struck me, again, as a trustee, is, we'd all have, trying to get transactions or whatever, we'd all have our pitch, and I don't mean that derisively, but, our patter. And these are the folks who are creating the data that we then use and, spread to the rest of the world. So that, when I'm able to say things like 4 times less layoffs, these are the folks that track information like that. And it's just so important to that knowledge helps us spread the word.
Yeah, I think people don't fully understand, who've not close to the legislative process, how important this research has been in keeping ESOPs with all the tax benefits they have. You see this reported all the time. When the UK passed its legislation, there was some research in the UK, but a lot of the justification was, look what happened in the US. And now in Canada, very probably it will create legislation somewhat like either the US or the UK. And again, they used our experience and our research to say, hey, this works. So, we don't have a political army. We don't, we're not the NRA. And there's not a lot of political donations and millions of voters. This idea sells because people think it works. And the research is what shows it works.
Corey, I love that. And it always leads to other ideas in my mind. I, have talked in the past, I would love during an employee ownership month to have like the state senators do a picnic at the state capitol one day during Employee Ownership Month, ideally all on the same day. Invite the politicians, but only let, this to me is key, only let them talk about employee ownership. Nothing else.
That'll be a challenge.
That is very true. But to celebrate employee ownership and bring up that mindfulness, but it is so cool to see all the work that you've done. And we have come so far since you started the NCEO in 1981. And, and we're much better even than when I got involved in 2008. The reality is the policing of the transactions are significantly better than they were. And you can count
they are in a lot of ways
now. And all these different things are just absolutely wonderful. Is there anything that you would like to cover that we didn't?
No, I think that really covers it. I would love, of course, for people to buy the book, but what I really hope is that this book will be a way for you to go sell the idea to other people. So, buy a copy and give it to your colleagues, give it to your legislator, give it to the reporter at your local paper. Say, hey, this is an idea that you really need to cover. And just to be clear, none of the royalties, none of the sales proceeds, anything that's attributable to my being an author of the book, and much of the part that's attributable to John, to his part, is going to the center. So I don't get anything out of this book. So this is an effort to try to help support the cause.
I love that. And we'll just say briefly that on September 20th, which is about 1 week after this episode drops, you're actually having the official book launch party. The folks can get more information at the NCEO website.
It's virtual.
And we'll include a link. You and Michael Corey, I noticed. Michael is a great guy. I've met him at a number of conferences.
It's a wonderful story.
VP of Web Industries, and you and he are going to, can you just tell us a little bit about the book launch, online, virtual?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about what's in the book and the arguments that we make. And Michael, who's an extraordinarily eloquent guy and fortunately a lifelong friend, his first real job was with the NCEO, and that's how he got into employee ownership. Michael's going to talk about the really amazing journey at Web Industries and the just extraordinary things that they've done, a lot of which is because of Michael. And he wrote the afterword to the book, and it's worth buying the book for Michael's afterword. It's really moving.
I love that. And Web Industries, we've talked through the years, our biggest moment in the spotlight perhaps was when Rob Zaccaro was able to speak to President Clinton, I think in 96.
Great guy,
and Rob, of course, was at Web Industries. So they certainly have been doing it right and leading the way for a very long time. Corey, thank you so much for your time. Thank you. And I feel a little bit sheepish saying this because I don't have a role to speak on behalf of employee ownership, but thank you for a career that has just enhanced not just so many in the United States, but literally around the world. And if there are only one or two people where I would say this, but if someday we get an Employee Ownership Hall of Fame, you would be a consensus first-class entry. And I'm not exaggerating. It could even rightfully be called the Corey Rosen Employee Ownership Hall of Fame. Such have been your contributions. So just on behalf of a lot of people, just thank you so much. And I can't wait to see what you continue to do in the years ahead.
Well, thanks. I don't ever plan to retire unless I'm not making contributions anymore, because working in this field literally every day when I get up, and I don't get paid, I haven't gotten paid for doing this for a long time. When I get up in the morning, I think I am so fortunate to be able to do what I do. It's just been an extraordinary blessing, and it's possible, Bret, because of people like you and all the people who've supported us. So I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. And I smiled when you said that, because the reality is I was very fortunate, with the trustee firm, sold it in 2019. I don't take advertisements on the podcast. I don't sell subscriptions on the podcast. I just love talking about employee ownership and would like to think that I play a bit of a role in helping spread the word.
You do.
And also, like you, very fortunate to do that. Corey, thank you so much for all of your time with me today. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Bret. Really appreciate it.
With that, we'll wrap up today's episode. My thanks again to Corey Rosen, founder of the NCEO, and so much more. Check out our show notes for more information. Buy a copy of his book. And thank you so much for listening. This is Bret Keisling. Be well.
We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook at EO Podcast Network and on Twitter at EsOP Podcast. This podcast has been produced by Bret Keisling for the EO Podcast Network. Original music composed by Max Keisling. Branding and marketing by Bitsy Plus Design. And I'm Bitsy McCann.